I'll go ahead and briefly introduce the idea for the panel, introduce our speakers, and then sit down. The title is 50 Years of Gender Studies and Social Justice Advocacy at Penn, and it is made up of some of our colleagues who not only founded the program, but kept it going for so many years, and who continue to be models of feminist commitment and activism and scholarship to all of us. So I will introduce them in the alphabetical order on which they appear, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Rita Barnard, who is second to the end, is professor of English and Comp Lit here at Penn. She directed the GSWS program and what was then the Alice Paul Center from 2004 to 2011. So when I came here in 2006, Rita was GSWS and APC, along with Demie, whom I'll be introducing in a moment. Among her recent publications are the Cambridge Companion to Nelson Mandela, South African Writing and Translation, Trump, Zuma, and the Grounds of U.S.-South African Comparison, and many articles on post-colonial women's writing. Our next speaker, who was also GSWS and APC when I came, is Demie Kurz. Demie was co-director of GSWS and APC for 29 years. You can, so if you go into our exhibit in the Lee Library, you can see so many posters and programming and some photos of Demie. Very, very good ones, but, with Anita Hill. In 1992, but Demie had a hand in so much of that programming for those 30 years. So, and she retired from her position as co-director in 2017, and she's currently a research affiliate in the Department of Sociology. She was also the co-founder of Care Work Network, an international network of researchers, policymakers, and advocates involved in various domains of care work. And on top of all of this, Demie has a forthcoming book titled Letting Go: Parenting Teens and Young Adults in a Time of Uncertainty. Keep an eye out for that. It's coming out with Oxford later this year. Unfortunately, Carroll Rosenberg and Diane Sjolander are not able to join us today. So I will move on to introducing our speaker and reintroducing our moderator for those of you who weren't here yesterday. Tracy has been affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania in numerous roles since 1968. She was, again, on the ground. It's thanks to her work that we're here today. She recently retired from the Women's Law Project, a public interest law center in Pennsylvania, focusing on a range of gender-based issues, including abortion, employment discrimination, and gender-based sexual and domestic violence. And she, like all of our speakers, is I think, an example of a combination of activism, teaching, and scholarship that we try to cultivate in our program and center. And finally, I'll introduce her more briefly, since many of you got to. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I skipped. How could I forget Phyllis? I think in looking at Rosenberg and Sjolander not being here today, you somehow got grouped with them, but you are thankfully here today. Phyllis Rackin, my colleague in the English department, and someone who many of you know as one of the most generous and wonderful colleagues and mentors and teachers here at Penn, is professor of English Emerita here at Penn. She is former president of the Shakespeare Association of America, the author of numerous books and articles on Shakespeare and related subjects, the winner of the Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching, and a plaintiff in a precedent-setting sex discrimination case, Rackin versus the University of Pennsylvania. And if you have not had a chance, you might look through the program. There are some DP clippings from some of the coverage of Phyllis's case, including, and well, actually, this isn't in the program, but it was in my opening remarks on Thursday. One of the things that I came across in preparing the program and working on the archives was a piece published by Carroll in the DP when Phyllis's decision was announced, when Phyllis won against Penn and its army of lawyers. Carroll published a piece declaring this a win for not only Penn, not only Phyllis, and not only women's studies, but also Penn. And I think Phyllis's presence here and all of the work that so many have done here is testament to that. Finally, I will introduce our moderator, who many of you met yesterday. Elisa Foster is the director of Penn's Women's Center, and she has been vital in carrying on the mission of the Winter Center. So I'm looking outside the Women's Center for many years since she arrived at Penn, and she is also a continued ally of GSWS and the FQT Center in really thinking about how much gender, sexuality, feminist studies are up against now, as at least as much as when they started in 1973. And I'll be saying a bit about that in my remarks on the next panel. So again, thank you to all of you for taking the time to be here, and we're looking forward to everything you have to say.
Thank you. Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay, good. So good morning. My name is, again, Elisa Foster. I am the director of the Women's Center. I've been at the Women's Center for 7 years almost next month. I'm really excited about this panel. I've, been poring over boxes and boxes of material in the Women's Center in preparation of moving our materials to the university archives and figuring out a way to digitize and make accessible those materials so the history continues to live on, to be accessible to our students, to our community. What I think one of the themes that we've seen throughout the last 3 days has been how important it is to tell our own histories, to tell our stories and share our histories from our own perspectives and talk about them the way we lived them and experienced them, and not let other people tell our stories and share our histories. And I think that has come through in many ways throughout this conference so far, when we talked about the Transoral History Project, when we talked about the student work and the scholarship. We talked about Linda Hart last night. That was so moving and so powerful. So I'm really, really just honored to be here with this group today to talk about social justice and the movement and the work that they've done on campus and here at Penn, and the work they've done that informs the work that we continue to do today. So I'm going to start off by asking Carroll Tracy to share a little bit of the context for us. You were here at the beginning, and I think there's so many of us that don't know, what were the events that led up to the sit-in in 1973 and what the history looked like back then. So can you share a little bit for us?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Elise. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I just want to start out by saying how proud I am to be part of the GSWS family. And I realize this fall it will be 30 years that I have been teaching my class on law policy and sex discrimination. Older than I think a few people in the audience, including one of my students. And at the same time, as Melissa said, I was my full-time job, my life's job was as a director of the Women's Law Project in Philadelphia. And I will just take a moment to mention that the Women's Law Project just won a major abortion rights case in Pennsylvania. And I'm really happy that it started on my watch. I also am looking forward to celebrating the Penn Women's Center in May in this important 50th anniversary year. So it's not only the 50th anniversary of women's studies in the Penn Women's Center, it's the 50th anniversary of Women Organized Against Rape, the 50th anniversary of Women Against Abuse, and the 50th anniversary of the Women's Law Project. So a lot went on 50 years ago. But I also want to say, in the years that I have been teaching here at Penn, that I think I have learned as much as I have taught. And I've really been grateful to have the opportunity to be part of GSWS. But today, I'm not going to focus on any of the legal matters that I have been involved in, except making that one important announcement. But instead, I want to talk about the history of advocacy at Penn. And as Melissa said, my relationship with Penn goes back to 1968 when I was hired as a secretary in the city planning department. I graduated from Catholic high school. My parents didn't have the funds to send me to college. I graduated in 1964. And in the 4-year span, I had 6 jobs as a secretary, having quit or been fired from the previous 5. I came to Penn because Penn had an evening program, the College of General Studies, that gave Penn employees tuition assistance and remarkably had the same faculty as the college. While I was working as a secretary, though, I very quickly became a union organizer, objecting mostly to the invisibility of the secretarial staff. And sadly, I failed. But I did help secure union rights for the woefully underpaid, mistreated cafeteria workers. And around that time, women faculty and administrators were organizing efforts to demand that the newly enacted affirmative action regulations be implemented at the university. And they were also organizing a major conference on the status of women at Penn. Once again, secretaries were ignored, and once again, I objected. This time, the women welcomed me and invited me to participate in a newly formed organization called WEOP, Women for Equal Opportunity, at the University of Pennsylvania. I see Janice smiling. I was a student of Janice's, I might add. At the time, there were about 40 members. They were all faculty. And just kind of, by the way, a copy of the mailing list for all the women faculty and administrators that was used to invite them to that conference fell into my desk. And I had the skills that my faculty colleagues did not have. I could type. I could run the mimeograph machine, and most of you won't know what, or anyone young here won't know what that is. But it was an early version of a copier, but a far more physical one. And I also had access to the university mail system. I know how to use it. So I sent an invitation to everyone on that list and urged the faculty and administrators to pass on this information to the secretarial staff. So our membership grew from 40 to 500 in a very short period of time. And I believe it was at the opening session of the Conference on Women when Martin Meyerson discussed the status of women and focused only on faculty. And then once again, I felt obliged to point out to him the exclusion of the majority of the female workforce at Penn. So at that point, it became evident to the leadership of WEOP that I should become the primary spokesperson for WEOP. So I then attended meetings with the president and provost, had letters to the editor and to the almanac published, pointing out ongoing inequities, letters that I might add were heavily edited by my colleagues. I remember Phoebe LeBoy, the late Phoebe LeBoy, saying, we got to work on your grammar, your spoken grammar a little bit, Carroll. Put aside these fancy letters. But Karen Gaines was the editor of the Almanac, and she, among other things, taught me the power of using the press. And I have to add, everything I've learned during this period have framed how I have behaved the rest of my professional life. So what was really interesting, it's not to say that the faculty in any way were silenced, but very sophisticated strategies emerged regarding who, where, and when everyone would speak and act out. And it turned out that I was less vulnerable to retribution than faculty and administrators were, because it would have looked really bad to fire a low-paid secretary. So clearly, key leaders at that time were Phoebe LeBoy and Helen Davis, both of whom had extensive experience in the local and national civil rights and anti-war movements. And sadly, both of them are gone to us. And key to all of this were the secretaries and administrators who, with extensive knowledge of departmental operations, were instrumental in passing out important information about hiring and other policies in the department. Now, during this time, an organization of Black faculty and administrators, the BFA, formed, and leaders of BFA and WEOP formed an alliance that assured that neither would take an action that would harm the other. Key members of that were the late Sam Sylvester and the late Ornice Dorsey and my ongoing good friend Jackie Wade. In the meantime, for me personally, staff in the financial aid and admissions office, who were members of WEOP, helped me secure financial aid, and I was admitted as a full-time undergraduate and was in the first women's studies cohort before it was a program. It was in the College of Thematic Studies, if I remember correctly. So I provide this background now to show the essential nature of collective action and community building that was necessary to prepare for the response to the gang rape in 1973. We saw news reports that 2 students at Penn's nursing school had been gang raped at 34th and Chestnut Street, and shock and fear erupted. We were hearing rumors. We didn't know how many assaults were going on campus, but a meeting was held at the Christian Association, which was the location of all anti-war and any radical activity. And that was organized with the then Director of Public Safety. At some point in his talk, he told the audience of women the way to avoid rape was to not wear provocative clothing. A student, Rose Weber, famously stood up and said to him, "I can walk buck naked down this campus, and your job, sir, is to protect me." Well, that resulted in an instantaneous eruption of outrage, and I honestly have no memory of how he got out of the room. Coincidentally, the feminist poet Robin Morgan was scheduled to do a reading the next night or two. Cynthia Secor, who was in the English department, organized that, and she was also a key organizer of the Women's Studies Planners. So she filled in Robin, and at the end of her reading, Robin unequivocally urged immediate and meaningful action. So back to the CA we all went, and a local and now quite famous artist named Jody Pinto attended Robin's reading and joined us. So we were discussing a broad range of issues on all the needs on campus. But Jody, who had just organized what was a new and very radical organization called Women Organized Against Rape, convinced us to stay on one topic, and that topic was rape, and to create demands to prevent it on campus and to support victims who had been assaulted. So the initial demands that came out were very practical. We wanted better lighting on campus. We wanted alarms in bathrooms. We wanted a free bus service for those who lived off campus. We wanted walking escorts. We wanted self-defense classes. And we wanted assurance that information about location and incidents of sexual assault would be published in the Almanac. And we wanted the creation of a victim advocate within the police department to assist rape victims in securing appropriate medical and forensic services and to provide intervention with the police and prosecution when needed. So a meeting was scheduled to present these demands with President Meyerson, Provost Steller, Vice President Johnson, and Dean of Students Tish Emerson. So this is when Carroll Smith Rosenberg and I were working, and I also was a student of Carroll Smith Rosenberg's. So she and I, she was in the history department. Excuse me a sec. And she didn't have tenure. I can't remember because her husband had tenure, and those were the rules in those days. So I suppose she was a lecturer. I should have asked her about this. And she is really sorry that she can't be here today, but I speak somewhat in her name. So she and I were selected to be the key negotiators. The team was set up to organize a rally in the sit-in. It was an all-women sit-in. Men were not allowed to participate. Women's studies classes were held in the hallway of the first floor of college during the day. And in College Hall 200, the big auditorium was where students stayed overnight. So it lasted 3 or 4 days, and as the demands were being met, we were not asking to end a war. We were asking for very practical things. It became clear that a women's center with staff to oversee the implementation and monitoring of these projects would be needed, and that the university had to stop all the stalling around the creation of a women's studies program. Carroll Smith Rosenberg and I, at the end, were negotiating these issues with Vice President Johnson, and he would not commit to the funding of either, and especially a women's center. That was a whole new idea. He thought there might be a room someplace they could give us where we could all gather. But while we were negotiating these issues, we received an urgent request to get up to College Hall 200, because this was at the end of the business day, because there was an unknown woman protester there who was calling on protesters to join her to go out in the neighborhood with straps and belts to beat up men. I ran upstairs. Fortunately, the rest of the no one paid attention to her. But CSR stayed behind, and she closed the deal on both women's studies and a staffed women's center. So directors were hired. I eventually got my bachelor's degree in 1975, and I got a job to create a women's center for the bicentennial celebration. And then in 1977, the director resigned, and I applied for and got my dream job. So I continued to work on employment issues, develop leadership programs for undergraduate women, and worked with victim service specialist Ruth Wells. And I am very sad to report that Ruth Wells, who was a genuine hero to me, passed away last week.
Oh.
And Joanne Mitchell and I, yesterday, were able to attend a service for her. But Ruth Wells was amazing in the way she helped support rape advocates navigate both university conduct systems and with the overwhelming and not very responsive Philadelphia criminal justice system. So as I am talking, Ruth, Helen, Phoebe, Sam, and Jack, and Ornice are all gone. I do just wish everyone to take a moment to think about those wonderful people. So then in February of 1983, Andrea Pleskow, an undergraduate at Penn, whom I have also recently learned has passed away, came to my office to tell me that she had just learned that a student had been gang raped at a fraternity. I asked her to find the student and bring her to me. Ruth Wells and I spoke with her. Ruth called the district attorney, but the student unequivocally did not want to prosecute, but did want the students to know how much they had harmed her. The Daily Pennsylvanian quickly learned about the train, as the frat boys wrote about it in their party log. And it became a news story, a major news story on campus in Philadelphia and nationally. And I felt obliged, of course, to speak out on behalf of this young woman. Unfortunately, the young men took it upon themselves to visit President Hackney, and President Hackney made the mistake of actually talking to them in a rather sympathetic way. So it became an enormous crisis on this campus. And the story actually is too long and too complex to go into today, but to say the least, the university administration grossly mishandled it. And this story was carefully chronicled months later in an Inquirer magazine by a news reporter named Mark Bowden, who prior to that was a sports reporter. They rotated in the Inquirer. So he actually was a very neutral person who came in and he interviewed many of the boys who were involved and described in detail the event, and quite clearly in doing so, described a gang rape of a partially conscious girl. Except the boys' words themselves described what they thought was group sex. So at this time, I had also completed, I'd gone to law school while I was at the Women's Center to Temple Law School. And I knew that as I was speaking out against the university, and in particular, one article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in which I criticized the president and the university, I knew would have some ramifications for the rest of my career, and that to the extent that I had any influence on university policies, they would wane very quickly. And it was time for me to practice law as well. So I stayed at Penn for an additional year with Phoebe LeBoy, who was in leadership of University Council, and made University Council conduct its own review and demanded reforms and got assurances that the civil lawsuit filed on behalf of the victim was settled with adequate compensation for her recovery. So after saying all of this, my message today, after reviewing my history and being connected to contemporary experiences through my teaching, is to reaffirm the essential need for community. Collaboration and cooperation are essential. Debate, disagreement on priorities, policies, and direction is healthy. Know that priorities and strategies change. What worked in 1968, 1973, 1983 doesn't work today. But it's also important to be open to new ideas. And I have to say, I applaud university personnel who are now vigorously defending academic freedom. But I also recognize that higher education is increasingly corporatized, which is manifestly evident on this campus, given its recent history. And that hierarchy, bureaucracies, and silos are obstacles to community building, and efforts are needed to break down the walls of this separation. And I end by saying I've been an activist all my life, but I have never seen a threat to democracy and human rights greater than we are facing now. SCOTUS has already overturned Roe, and more is to come. November looms large. So I just say that we have to find new ways, and we have to do everything we can to actively participate in society right now and to work together, because the threat is enormous. And finally, I just want to say there were far too many people for me to recognize today, but I've told Elisa that I am going to write more, and to Melissa and about more of what I knew, because I think it is so critical to recount the history and to learn from it, and to move on. And I particularly want to thank the staff of GSWS, who have been so good to me for so many years, and to look forward to see what comes next at PWC. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carroll. There are so many full circle moments that I felt in your conversation. One that comes to mind in particular, excuse me, that I want to highlight, because I think it's really important, is you mentioned the Christian Association and that being a space for radical activity for people on the ground doing social justice work. And over the years, that building, which is now known as the Arch Building, has evolved, has housed many different spaces and administrative offices on campus. Later, they, when the MACU, Black Cultural Center, the Pan Asian Community House, and La Casa Latina were formed, they started their offices on the, I think I'm supposed to say, the garden level of the Arch Building, and became a home to so many students over the years. And very recently, that building became accessible to the whole entire building, became devoted to the cultural resource centers and devoted to students of underrepresented identities, marginalized identities, students who need a home on campus. So I'm really excited to say that Patch La Casa and MACU, in addition to the Women's Center and the LGBT Center and the Greenfield Intercultural Center, now have full access to that space. And we have meeting rooms, we have study rooms, we have the student groups affiliated with our spaces have priority access. Natives at Penn has an office, their own space in that building. So I think it's really important to name those moments where it's like, oh, full circle. And I had a really good conversation with Diane Sjolander on the phone about that a couple of months ago, and I was really excited to learn about that history. But as we continue talking about the history and how things have come together, Phyllis, would you like to add on to Carroll's story?
I love that Carroll ended her wonderful talk with thanking the program, because I too had many reasons to be thankful to women's studies. It gave me the intellectual stimulation in faculty, graduate student seminars. It gave me opportunities to teach bright, motivated students who shared my desire to read the plays of Shakespeare and his contemporaries from a feminist perspective, and it provided a badly needed stimulus for my own development as a feminist teacher and scholar. But I'm far from unique in any of this, and you don't really need me to tell you what a treasure we've had in the Penn Women's Studies program. I'm guessing that the reason I was asked to speak this morning is that I've been at Penn for such a long time. Even longer, in fact, than the program itself. But the first thing I have to say is that I wouldn't be here at all, and neither would our extraordinary program, if it hadn't been for the courage and commitment of many generations of women among us, and one of them sitting right here beside me, as you've heard. I wouldn't be here at all because I was denied tenure, and my employment was terminated as of the end of the academic year 1969-1970. As soon as I heard about the denial, I began looking for another job, and I counted myself lucky that I found one at a local college for women. I didn't think the denial was justified, and I knew the procedures were irregular, but I had no intention of fighting. What happened next was that a group of students who heard about the denial petitioned the university to reconsider. They made their decision on their own, without my knowledge or input. If I had known, I would probably have tried to discourage them, because although I was angry about what had happened, my main objective at that point was to preserve my academic career. Is somebody's telephone giving me a musical accompaniment? Oh, it's gone. No, there it goes again.
Well, somebody.
Oh, good Lord. I'm sorry, it's a little distracting.
I think my phone is on. It's on.
Pretty song.
I've never heard that ringtone.
It's a regular appointment I usually have at this time. Actually, talking to Cynthia's record. I'll talk to her tomorrow.
Okay.
Many apologies.
Back to the student protest. If I'd known about it, I probably would have tried to discourage them, because although I was angry about what had happened to me, my main objective at that point was to preserve my academic career. In short, the students' courage and initiative far exceeded mine. They were right, and I was wrong. The university's response to the students' petition was a series of even more irregular actions. You might even call them outrageous. So outrageous that I finally did protest. First, to the university's Academic Freedom Committee, then to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and finally in a lawsuit that turned out to set a good precedent for other faculty women, both at Penn and elsewhere. I'm telling this very quickly, but it took 5 years. Anyway, none of this would have happened without that initial student protest and without the remarkable support I later received from Carroll, Tracy, and WEOP. Without that kind of collective effort, I doubt that we would have had our women's studies program either. The first time I remember hearing about the program was in the spring of 1973, when the women's sit-in at Carroll that Carroll described at College Hall took place, and finally resulted in promises by the administration for much-needed improvements in women's safety and the establishment of a women's center as well as a women's studies program. This history that Carroll told you is important because it reminds us that women's studies was always more than an academic program. It was born out of women's political protest, and the demands of the protesters included support for women's physical safety and social well-being, as well as the establishment of women's studies. The sit-in was the first time I heard about the women's studies program, but others had been working for over a year to pave the way for its coming. In the spring of 1972, a group of women students, faculty, and administrators presented a proposal for the program to Martin Meyerson, who was then president of the university. Meyerson was a consummate master of diplomacy and delay. He suggested that the women should spend the summer developing a more detailed proposal. They did, and the result, 36 pages long, was indeed detailed. It included, among other things, an extensive survey of existing programs in the United States, a detailed proposal for integrating women's studies within the existing departmental structure of the university, a comprehensive list of the academic personnel and support staff that would be required, proposals for governance, curriculum, research opportunities, library facilities and materials, and outside funding. Appendices included a detailed budget for the academic year 1973-74 and a list of women's studies courses to be offered. Nothing much happened, however, until after the sit-in, and even then, what we got fell pretty far short of the ambitious proposal submitted by the planners. Instead of a department with its own core faculty and instructional budget, the university appointed an academic administrator to be a member of the staff in the office of the dean of the soon-to-be-abolished College for Women, and allowed 10 courses to be offered by existing faculty under the aegis of a larger program called the College of Thematic Studies. Rose Weber, a member of the class of 1975, who went on to become a civil rights lawyer, thinks she was probably the first women's studies major to graduate from Penn, but she did so as a dual major in women's studies and biology, and her women's studies major was listed as, quote, an individualized major rather than a concentration in an existing recognized discipline. We've come a long way since then, offering over 50 courses each year, a major, a minor, a graduate certificate, research grants, teaching awards, and much, much more. With all this, some of us might be tempted into complacency, assuming that it's now time to rest comfortably on our hard-earned laurels. But I think we still have a long way to go. We still haven't achieved the status of a department. Our mission and our name have expanded impressively to include gender, sexuality, queer, and transgender studies. But women's studies seem to be contracting in the process. In this connection, I think it's important to remember that women's studies at Penn was always more than an academic program. It originated in a women's sit-in. It was paired from the first with the Penn Women's Center, and it was conceived from the beginning as a component of a political effort to fight for the rights of women. However, there isn't a single title in the program for this symposium that commemorates that purpose. The title for our session, 50 Years of Gender Studies and Social Justice Advocacy at Penn, does mention social justice advocacy, but it doesn't mention women. The words gender and sexuality appear repeatedly throughout the program. And there's even a session devoted specifically to trans oral history, but there isn't a single section with a title that indicates a specific focus on women. It isn't as though women's rights are no longer under attack. In Afghanistan, women are now banned from receiving any education beyond the 6th grade. In Iran, a woman died last year in police custody after being arrested for failing to wear a headscarf in the required manner. Here, in the good old USA, preteen girls impregnated by rapists can now be forced to carry the babies to term. To be sure, many of the same people, both here and abroad, who are inflicting these horrors on girls and women are also devoted to the oppression of gay, trans, and queer people. Misogyny and homophobia have often been closely allied, but they are not the same. And given the sheer number of people who are affected by the oppression of women, and given its frightening increase in recent years, I think it's important to remember that the need for women's studies is no less urgent today than it was 50 years ago.
Thank you, Phyllis. Can we move down the panel to Rita?
It's such an honor and pleasure to be here today. The Trump era and its this effective distraction, I think, really makes memory something so precious. And I'm so glad that both Carroll and Phyllis emphasized this. And for me to think back to the years when I directed the program, I was not particularly qualified. I was not the obvious choice. But I think I came in at a time when I certainly learned so much, and when
what we were trying to do was particularly important. These were different times. I'm talking of 2004 to 2011. This was very much the post 9/11 era. Think back, George Bush, the war in Iraq, and then leading up to that amazing campaign of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and that election. I remember so well, Demie, how we were so anxious every day. Right. So this was a very strange time. I feel, of course, times became stranger and stranger, but this was a time, I think, what we did here was profoundly influenced by external and internal things. And the way that I would characterize the external would be this, the terrible kind of regress that 9/11 and the war in Iraq and the Bush era brought about, right? In terms of our program and the Alice Paul Center, I think what happened as a creative response was the beginning of the Global Gender Seminar. Many of you might remember it. Ayoko was absolutely crucial with that. It allowed us to think about the things that Phyllis has just urged us to think about, that the struggle is an international one, and that, we needed to transform our understanding of women's history in a much more international and global way. We also had a huge conference on women, gender, and war. Somehow I found that a very sad event, sitting through those 2-3 days, hearing about violence and particularly sexualized violence in war. But it was something that I felt was very, was very necessary and timely. And I hope some of you remember that conference as hugely important. I'll talk about some of the people who came in to speak with us about global gender issues in a second. But the other thing that happened that I think had a creative impact on what was then still the Alice Paul Center and the Women's Studies program was that we had made some incredible hires. Heather Love came on board, Catherine Sinder in the Annenberg School, later on David Eng. And this really forced us to think about the relationship between women's studies and sexuality studies. And it was in this, I don't know exactly when it happened, but within this framework of my time in women's studies my time in the program that our name changed to gender, sexuality, and women's studies. And unlike with other institutions where this was often a fraught matter, at Penn, I just felt like the established feminist scholars clearly saw that this was something that had to happen, a new direction in our general field. We also had in Heather Love and Catherine Sinder and others an understanding that, the field really had, the field of sexuality studies had to also look back to women's studies in those advances and debates and so on. So it was a wonderful confluence that I think allowed us to move forward while retaining the strengths of the past. And I just want to there's going to be many shout outs, but thank you, Phyllis. You were very much part of that. We initiated the Phyllis Rackin lectures and also remembered Linda Hart and with the Linda Hart Prize. So this led to another major conference, which I do hope you will remember. Heather Love spearheaded it, and it was really a state-of-the-field conference on sexuality studies, a wonderful event. I still remember the wonderful debate or sort of conversation between Lauren Berlant and Lee Edelman. Do you remember? A really major event that happened. we also, when it came in, I got many important lessons from senior people. And I remember a wonderful woman in chemistry, Martha, I forget her last name, but she said, you can't do science without money. You can't do anything without money. And I must admit, I wasn't a very good fundraiser, but we did deploy the funds that we had, I think, in very creative ways. We started the Berkowitz lectures and brought in amazing people. And I just want to remember a few of them. Again, if you were here, remember with me. Memory is important in this time that we're living in. We invited, for example, Vandana Shiva, the Indian ecofeminist. And I remember Demie, we were in a big room in Houston Hall, and Demie and I said, how many people will come? 75, we agreed. Put out 75 seats, and we just kept on bringing seats and seats and seats, and we had this wonderful, wonderful, inspiring reminder of the materiality of feminist thought and its connection with environmental thinking. We also brought in Margaret Atwood. And isn't it amazing how Margaret Atwood's significance just doesn't pale? A theocracy seems all the more likely. I hope not. I grew up under Afrikaner Christian nationalism, and when I hear those words, I shudder. But Margaret Atwood came and was absolutely wonderful. She sat for at least an hour signing everybody's books. I kept trying to scoot her along, and she was like, no, I always do this. I'm here for everybody. I remember Edwidge Dantica coming also as part of the a focus on global gender issues. And it's so wonderful always whenever you had a speaker, that person would galvanize a different groups of people. And I remember standing in front of the hall and seeing this sea of our Haitian students. I think every single student with a connection to Haiti was there to come and be there for Edwidge Dantica. Similarly, I remember when Marjan Satrapi, the Iranian graphic artist, came. In fact, she got so annoyed with me when I spoke of her work as graphic novels. She said, no, it's comics, right? And this sort of attitude that she had was so much part of the wonderful books about the revolution in Iran and sort of her survival as a feisty woman in those times. I remember also very well around the election time, we had the journalist Katha Pollitt come, and could you remember, Demie? No. And Katha met with so many students and was such a sort of an insightful and reassuring force at that time when we were all so ready to be rid of George Bush. That so much it seemed to lie on that election. And I remember another event, the late Barbara Ehrenreich, talk about somebody with a long history of fighting the good fight. Barbara had just published her wonderful book, Bright-Sided, which linked so beautifully with the new work in feminist affect studies, and spoke about how it wasn't, the pink ribbons or the coloring book that she was given in the hospital when she had breast cancer, but it was her feminist anger that got her through this. And this generated this wonderful book criticizing the compulsory optimism of American culture. I want to just say a few personal things. I learned so much in the time that I was in women's studies. I learned from Janice. I learned from Kathy Pice and Nancy Hirschman. I learned so much from Demie. It was just really a time when community was so important to me. The first time that I really had to work with people across the disciplines. So breaking down walls remains absolutely crucial for us looking ahead. But I think also the need for memory, which you two both emphasized. It was even hard to remember those times, right? But the time, the post 9/11 time was certainly, what led up to this precarious position in which we find ourselves now. And I can only join my lovely colleagues, Phyllis, who's always been such a lovely person in my life, and urge for ongoing activism and ongoing collectivity. Thank you.
Demie, thank you. I just have to say a quick memory of Rita. I have so many memories here, and I know and love so many of you. Rita did it at least once, maybe several times, said to Luce and me, we're going to Annenberg. There was a very, very famous African musician coming. It might have been Dumani Diabate. I knew nothing about that.
Abifate.
Yeah, and ever since I've loved that music. Anyway, at the break in the big Annenberg space, Rita walked. I had gone up to speak to the singer, and he sort of put his arm around me, and somebody took a photo. And Rita came around the corner, and she was in shock. It was sort of like Paul McCartney had his arm around. So I really appreciated that. I need glasses now more than I used to. So I'm Demie Kurz. I was co-director here for 29 years. It was a great experience. I'm very grateful to have had this position and worked with so many of you. I want to tell briefly a positive story, fully cognizant that we are in a dark, terrible time. This morning driving in, I learned that now the right wing is going after the American Library Association to attack what they provide for schools, libraries. But we've had a huge success here, and I'm so glad we're celebrating it. Why do I say that? Well, when I first got my position, I also always had an affiliation with the sociology department. I'm a sociologist. This older, very gentleman-like faculty member, Ivar Berg, said to me, Demie, this is lovely. You have this position. Now, I must warn you, you should be looking for other positions. This is a fad. And so Ivar, if you could so, that's where we started from. Or, in college, at Wellesley College, we read David McClellan, a famous Harvard psychologist. We read his book, The Achievement Motive, it was called. It was routinely assigned in college. Okay, page 1, footnote 1. This study is based on Harvard freshmen. Harvard then was all men. So we were all learning about achievement based on Harvard freshmen. Oh, well. So the women's movement, the second wave of the women's movement was taking place in, 80s and 90s. And some women and men were on the streets protesting, and some in their labor unions, some in their schools, and it came to academia, where scholars said, hey, we don't want to learn about personality based on Harvard freshmen. We want to take charge of our fields and expand them in the way they should be expanded. So one of the first things was to add women who were absent from David McClellan or absent from a lot of research in most of the important disciplines. They were just absent. And So finding women was an early goal, and that was hugely important. It was controversial. Now, obviously, that's very insufficient, although, as Phyllis has pointed out, we can't lose the women. But anyway, I'll just say Ann Matter, who's retired from religious studies, she still lives in Philadelphia. I remember I asked her one September, "Oh, Ann, how was your summer?" And she said it was great. She always goes to Italy for her research. She said, "Oh, I found a saint." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Oh, well, I was in a church and I went to the attic and I found a scroll of a whole other woman we didn't know about." And I said, "Oh, are there a lot of those?" Being a sociologist, not a historian. She said, "Yes, there are a lot." And I said, "Well, did they just get buried or have any influence?" She said, back in whatever period of medieval studies she worked on, women would sometimes come into churches and testify, and they got away with it because they said they just heard the voice of God. And so, anyway, Anne, by the way, was one of scholars around the world, and many scholars here, who changed the field of medieval studies and brought a whole feminist perspective. The early field was white women. And of course, that was totally insufficient, wrong, whatever. And women of color and white women allies said, "Hey, you have to expand this field." Of course. Then global, very important, women, because in the U.S., maybe there were some more early resources for women's studies. As women around the globe began to do their own women's studies, they said, "Hey, we read your stuff, but it's quite Western, and we're going to do some of our work." And then, of course, the field expanded. So what I'm pointing to is how rich this field is, how well it's expanded. Then with sexuality studies, huge expansion of the field, transformation of the field. All of this was transforming, and now we have trans studies, as we've seen in this great conference. I just want to say evidence of this, the way I've looked back on the expansion of the field in these years is the way journals took place. I mean, were founded. Signs certainly is a very important journal. It was in women's studies. And our own Carroll Smith Rosenberg, I think her article is Signs, Volume 1, Number 1, Page 1, on young women in Philadelphia. Anyway, the journals just expanded. Even then, there's a journal in social science called Gender and Society. It's quite well regarded. But I had an early article in there on violence against women because before I came to Penn, I was part of a national research study saying, hello, there's violence against women, and documenting it. The editor of the journal was a strong feminist, and she said, I'm going to take this article because it's very solid, but it's a little risky. My journal is still young. I mean, the idea of studying violence against women was somehow, whoa, you're getting kind of fringy here. Like, really? No. Then here at GSWS, we kept a pace of all these developments, added courses, sought lectures, sought speakers, and we ran seminars, faculty seminars, the Global Gender Seminar, the Works in Progress Seminar. So it was a wonderful place for faculty to come and share these new perspectives that were so exciting. We also brought pressure on departments for hires. We met with department chairs. We co-sponsored events with departments, sometimes with a nudge. If you pay some, we'll get somebody for you. We wrote supporting letters if they wanted to hire someone, for example, a woman in science. As you know, we cross-listed courses. We did a lot. And the speakers, as Rita referenced, we just brought these wonderful speakers. And I also remember Vandana Shiva. What a joy it was to walk into the Hall of Flags and just have to run around and get chairs. That was very exciting. We also worked with the development office because, and Janice and all the directors, Nancy Hirschman, Liliana, we all knew that there were, am I missing anybody? Kathy later, but, there were women alums out there going through all this, and some of them were quite sympathetic. And so we made connections with them, including famously Judy Berkowitz, who happily was about to make a giant donation to Annenberg for something. And they said, sorry, we can't.
Wharton. Who was a Wharton donor?
Oh, well, different people have different members. Janice is Wharton. But in effect, Wharton said it was the wrong time. Was that it? That's
No. I mean, they had the money to Women's Studies, and I got to call them a Wharton V, ringing me out.
Okay. Thank you. That's a solid memory. All right. I'll put that in the memory bank. Thank you. Thank you. So we were always grateful to Judy Berkowitz. And I must say, one time, one of our major Judith R. Berkowitz lectures was, we brought Angela Davis. So, when we brought her, I thought, well, somebody's going to notice. And nothing happened. And then 2 weeks later, Demie, the phone's for you. It was Judy Berkowitz. Demie, she's a communist, right? Judy, hold on. She went to jail. She's now very prominent. She teaches at university. Don't worry about it. She said, okay, I won't worry about it. So anyway, again, the wonderful, just the wonderful directors, faculty directors I worked with who are here, Janice, Nancy, Liliana. I didn't really get to work with Melissa, but who am I missing?
Rita.
Rita. Right. Sorry. And of course, Luce Marin, who,
Yeah.
where's Luce? She was
here a minute ago.
Well, shout out to Luce. A friend of mine, a sociologist from UC Santa Barbara, came to visit me once, and we went. She knew all about our program. She had done a women's studies program there at Santa Barbara, and she talked to Luce a little bit, and I'm sorry, Luce can't hear this. I'll tell her later. She said, one of the reasons for the success of your program is that you have this person. And what she meant was the continuity, she wasn't talking about the academic side of things. She was talking about the way we hung together and made it work, despite potential controversies that other programs had, et cetera. So just a shout out to all the people who have made this possible, and a shout out to the people who organized this conference. Those of us who've organized conferences know what it takes to do something like this, and also for the gains that have been made in the last 5-10 years. More courses, the Trans History Project. I had a list. Where is it? Anyway, great that you're doing these continuing to do these great things. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a quick question for whoever wants to answer. But the team at the Women's Center, and we have a few of them here, Catherine and Tommy up front, and a few of our former directors, Lydia and Ellie, here today. They all know very well that we spend a lot of our time mentoring students and encouraging them to make wise decisions. And in their activism, in their academic work, in their personal lives, they come to us with all sorts of things, and we're here to support them. And yesterday I mentioned briefly that Take Back the Night rally is happening later this month, and our students are hosting a reproductive justice conference later this month. So I'm wondering if there's anything from your experiences and your stories that you would want us to bring back to them, as they're planning their work, as they're, doing some of those full circle moments that, 1973, things happening then, things happening now, happening again, it's all coming back. So is there anything that you can think of that you would want us to bring back to the students?
I would say Carol's point that she made so powerfully that, there used to be a slogan, sisterhood is powerful. And I think community and the New York Times would periodically gleefully run a story on the front page about rifts in the women's movement, rifts between black and white, rifts between gay and straight. And anybody who seeks to divide you is not a friend of the movement.
Yeah. And in a very practical thing, voting is essential. And I'm working with a group of retired lawyers to develop whatever ways we can to get out the vote. And part of what my job is going to be is to connect with as many faculty as I can, giving them talking points about what states it's important to register in. I mean, I did that in my class. I guess it was 2 years ago when I remember there was one student who was from Georgia. I said, "Now you got to stay in Georgia. You can't change your..." But to get as many registered, if they're from states where the stakes aren't as high. I mean, Pennsylvania is without a doubt a major state in the next election. And a lot of people are understandably worried or concerned about the current president and some of the actions he's taking or not taking. But the alternative is disaster. And just encouraging people to vote and do smart voting, I think is critical. And to get as much of that information on campus. And I remember talking to someone who was doing voter stuff, and he said, they don't want to listen to outsiders. And I said, you're right. If you're standing on campus leafleting, people don't know who you are. So that's why it's important to engage as much of the university communities as we can between now and next November, and with good, accurate talking points about what is at stake and why it's important. So to me, there's, quite frankly, nothing more important right now.
And I think we have a few minutes to open it up to the audience. If anyone is, I think we have a mic coming up. If you have a question. There.
One comment, a big positive for the program that wasn't mentioned here is that Claudia Golden, a professor at Harvard, who won the first Nobel Prize in Women's Studies, Penn is responsible for. She came to Penn after getting denied for tenure at Princeton and was working on slavery, and she's an economic historian. Penn Women's Studies got her interested in women's studies, and it's actually, I was struck, Phyllis, I didn't know about the role of students in your story, that it was students that brought her into women's studies. And she actually brought a Penn PhD student to the Nobel Prize award ceremony with her and gave Penn and that woman student the kudos for getting her interested in women's studies.
Wow.
And she feels very, very grateful to all of us. And I'm grateful to her, as I think we all should be, for getting real, serious academic recommendation from science for women's studies. That was just about.
Any other questions, thoughts? Sorry I came in late, but I just want to say thank you to all of you, because we wouldn't be having this conference, this celebration. Many of us wouldn't even be at Penn if it weren't for all of you. So thank you.
Hi, I want to echo the thank you. You guys were the trailblazers. I mean, a few of us were sort of started, and then we went off different ways. But I do want to, reiterate the call, how important this year is. And I'm with an organization called Philadelphia Neighborhood Networks, and we get out the vote. That is what we've been doing since 2004. And you may have noticed that Philadelphia, if it carries Philadelphia turnout, will carry Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania may carry the whole United States in the Electoral College. But there are many other states that are just as crucial. I know you all may not all come from Pennsylvania, but wherever you are, find organizations that are doing actual on-the-ground, get out the vote, knocking on doors, raising money, and supporting candidates. It is crucial this year because all of this depends on that. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your stories. It's really inspiring. I'm a current student, undergraduate, and I was just talking to Catherine. I'm about to leave Penn. I'm a senior, so only a few more months left. But it was really inspiring to hear your stories, and really, it's so important for us to know that we stand on the shoulders of giants, truly. And so my question for really anyone is, it's really easy to be disheartened by everything in the world, especially for like my generation. We're so connected. Every day on the news, we see something horrible. How do you stay motivated to continue the fight? Even seeing like the losses and seeing all the tragedies, like how do you stay motivated and to keep pursuing? Because you've been here for so long now. How do you keep it going?
I've thought about that a lot, if I may. And I think particularly the older ones, probably all of us, we grew up in an era of massive change. From 1963 to 1975, there were enormous legal wins. I talk about growing up when it was a radical act for women to wear slacks. Women wore house dresses, high heels, all of this, what the world was like in the late 50s and early 60s. And then, all hell broke loose. And I think because of that, we maintain an optimism that it's really, really hard for people who have been born after 1977 and have grown up, or whenever they were born, because it's been a series of fighting back and a series of losses. I mean, what could be bigger than losing Roe? So that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we have, because you were in my class, and I try, because everything I'm talking about in my class is essentially a trigger. discussion of what once was and what has been lost and what we need to do to gain. So it's a challenge, and I think it's something that we need to be thinking about. And those of us who have been around for a long while have to really step back up to the plate. I mean, the baby boomers, I think, are going to play a major role in this election, that's the only thing I can say to you, because I know how hard you've been working on getting out the vote and other issues. So that's my word.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. That's a great question. I mean, I think about former students and people in your generation, and on top of everything else that's not good is the looming threat of environmental catastrophe, which we didn't have. I mean, when I was in college, the women's movement hadn't started, but it was the Vietnam War. So what we faced was every day on the news, before they stopped showing body bags coming back of dead Americans, they shut that off. We just thought nothing could be worse. And then the photos on TV of slaughtered Vietnamese people, it was horrific. So we sort of thought we actually thought nothing could be worse than that. When the war's over, things will be fine. So I think for all of us, your question is applicable. We just have to stay motivated and fight. It's the only way. And for your generation and all of us to vote, for one thing, but just to protest, to whatever. I sometimes, when I'm a little discouraged, I think of African American people in this country and what it was like not just to live under slavery, but Jim Crow, and how they fought back. And yes, we still have racism in different forms, but it's a huge kind of progress that activism can get us to. I actually saw two historians recently that I had in college, and I said to them, "You taught us that the pendulum swings, right? It's going to swing." And they hesitated longer than I would have liked, but they said yes if we fight back. Yeah.
I want to add something to what Demie and Carroll said, which I think is the best answer, but I just have a little footnote. Because I'm older than anybody, and I was so optimistic during the 1960s. It looked like all the horrible repressions that had preceded that were over, that everything was on the upswing. I was so optimistic about the future. And then, things went down again. But I've lived long enough to see things go up and down a lot, the pendulum that Demie mentioned. And I think it's very easy, if you're living in a time when things are going down, to think they're going to continue to go down, just as when you're living in a time when things are going up, to think they're going to continue to go up. They don't. It will change, and we can make it change. And you just got to keep the faith and keep trying.
I just have something very small, but hopefully a thing of the heart to share with you. And that is that, you're graduating now. But please remember, we truly are your alma mater. I have been so encouraged of late by hearing from former students. One of our very lovely comparative literature PhD students recently died, like last week. Monica Popescu, who was brilliant. Yeah, Monica died. But it was so wonderful to see who rallied, and how every single member of her cohort was there for her. Recently, when the war broke out between Israel and Gaza,
one of my former students who just finished at Harvard Law came back to talk to his Penn professors because he didn't know he didn't know how to feel or think about the situation. Please just remember that the bonds that we forge here, especially in a major like yours, with people who care, that they will be there for you in future. And I think we just have to be there for each other, even if just in kindness, that kindness can turn into militancy and solidarity as well. You're not alone. I really thought your question was very touching, and it means a lot to me also. Like Phyllis was talking about, disappointments. I started my career when I got my offer from Penn the same week that Nelson Mandela walked out of prison to freedom. Whoa. And of course, I just wept. I just wept. I really thought life would be better now. And of course, there have been disappointments. Freedom has been curtailed. Hope has been curtailed, right? But we still are together, and we're still in the fight, and we're not giving up.
So, do we have time for
Gwendolyn, there's a question.
I think we're at time, so thank you.